There was a time when I looked at English and felt it was not for me. Not because I didn't want it, but because I believed it belonged to people who were already confident, already fluent, already ready. I wasn't ready, or so I thought. But life has a strange way of teaching you that readiness is not a feeling, it is a decision. So I stopped waiting. I started with what I had, a broken confidence, a curious heart, and a promise to myself. I will not fear this language anymore. I started speaking to myself without fear in a way that didn't feel natural at first, because I had spent so much time believing that speaking English required an audience, a teacher, or a perfect environment. But the truth slowly unfolded in front of me that the real classroom was inside my own mind, and the real barrier was not outside, but within my hesitation. So I decided to break that invisible wall by creating small moments of practice that no one else would witness, where I could be completely free from judgment, where I could make mistakes without feeling small, and where I could rebuild my confidence word by word, sentence by sentence, even if those sentences were broken or incomplete, because I realized that fluency does not begin with perfection. It begins with courage to speak when no one is clapping, when no one is correcting, and when no one is even listening. So I started talking to myself in English while doing ordinary things like getting ready in the morning, or sitting alone in my room, or walking without destination, turning these silent moments into conversations where I would describe what I was doing, what I was thinking, what I wanted, and sometimes even what I feared. And in those private dialogues, I discovered that my voice had been waiting for permission, that I was never giving it. So I gave it permission slowly, not in a dramatic way, but in small, consistent steps, where I would repeat simple sentences again and again until they stopped feeling strange. And even when I made grammatical mistakes, I did not stop myself anymore, because I understood that stopping was the real failure, not the mistake itself. And I began to notice that my tongue was learning to trust new sounds. My mind was learning to form thoughts without translating everything back to my native language. And my confidence was growing in a quiet way that did not depend on applause. Because for the first time, I was not performing for others, but practicing for myself. And this self-practice became my safe space where I could experiment with words, where I could pause without shame, where I could restart without frustration, and where I could repeat the same sentence 10 times until it felt like it belonged to me. And over time, this habit transformed my relationship with language from fear into familiarity, because I stopped seeing English as a subject and started seeing it as a tool for expression, something that carried my thoughts instead of controlling them. And in those moments of self-talk, I also realized that confidence is not something you receive from others, but something you build internally when you are willing to hear your own voice without criticism, when you are willing to sound imperfect and still continue, when you are willing to be both student and teacher at the same time. And slowly the silence that once intimidated me became my practice ground. The mirror became my audience, and my thoughts became my conversation partners. And I no longer needed permission to speak, because I had already been speaking to myself in every possible way, reshaping my fear into familiarity, reshaping hesitation into rhythm, and reshaping doubt into something that no longer had control over my voice. I turned my environment into a classroom in a way that didn't require books, fees, or formal lessons, because I began to realize that learning English was not limited to a physical institution, but existed everywhere around me, if I was willing to observe with intention. So instead of waiting for the perfect course or perfect teacher, I started using everything in my surroundings as raw material for practice. And this shift changed the way I looked at my daily life, because suddenly nothing was ordinary anymore. Every sound became an opportunity. Every sentence I heard became something I could repeat. And every word I saw became something I could absorb slowly without pressure. So I began with simple things like listening carefully to English songs, not just for entertainment, but for understanding pronunciation, rhythm, and expression, pausing and repeating lines, even if I didn't fully understand the meaning at first, because I knew that familiarity comes before mastery. And then I started watching videos, interviews, and conversations, not as a passive viewer, but as an active learner who would pause frequently, rewind sentences, and try to imitate the tone, the pauses, and even the emotions behind the words. And in that process, I discovered that learning is not about speed, but about attention, not about how much you consume, but how deeply you engage with what you consume. And then I extended this practice to written language as well, noticing English words on billboards, signs, social media posts, and subtitles, treating them like small lessons scattered across my environment. And I would repeat them silently or aloud, trying to build sentences from them in my mind, connecting new vocabulary with real-life situations instead of memorizing isolated words. And slowly, my surroundings stopped being just surroundings and started becoming a living language lab where I was both student and observer. And even conversations around me became learning material, because I would listen carefully when others spoke English, even if I was not part of the conversation, focusing on how people naturally construct sentences, how they express emotions, how they pause, and how they choose words differently depending on context, and I would mentally replay those sentences later, breaking them down, reconstructing them, and practicing them in my own voice. And over time, I realized that immersion does not require travel to another country. It requires awareness in your own world. And that realization gave me a sense of freedom, because I was no longer dependent on external systems to improve myself. I was using life itself as my teacher, and this mindset also removed the pressure of studying English in a rigid way, because everything became fluid, everything became part of my growth. And I started noticing improvement in my understanding, in my listening, and in my ability to form thoughts more naturally without translating every idea step by step. And what once felt like a foreign language slowly became a familiar presence in my daily routine. Something I could interact with rather than struggle against. And this transformation didn't happen overnight, but through consistent attention to the world around me, through curiosity that refused to stay silent, and through the decision to treat every moment as a chance to learn rather than waiting for a structured lesson. And in that process, I began to see that the environment is not separate from education. It is education itself, if we are willing to engage with it differently, if we are willing to see beyond the obvious and find meaning in the ordinary, if we are willing to listen when the world is speaking in a language we are still learning to understand, I accepted mistakes as part of growth in a way that slowly changed my entire relationship with learning. Because earlier every mistake felt like a setback, something that made me hesitate, something that made me question my ability, and something that quietly built fear inside me every time I tried to speak. But over time I began to understand that mistakes are not the opposite of learning. They are actually the proof that learning is happening. And this understanding did not come suddenly. It came through repeated moments of discomfort where I would say something wrong, pause, feel embarrassed for a second, and then realize that nothing actually broke, nothing ended, and the world kept moving even after my imperfect sentence. So I started observing people who spoke fluently, and I noticed something important, that they were not perfect. They were simply not afraid of being imperfect. And that changed my perspective completely, because I realized that fluency is not the absence of mistakes, but the confidence to continue despite them. So I allowed myself to be wrong intentionally. I stopped overthinking every sentence before speaking, and I gave myself permission to sound awkward, to pause in the middle of thoughts, to search for words that did not come instantly, and even to mix languages when needed, because the goal was expression, not perfection. And slowly this mindset began to free me from the pressure that had been holding me back for so long. And instead of criticizing myself after every error, I started analyzing it calmly, asking myself what I could learn from it, how I could improve it next time. And this small shift turned mistakes from emotional weight into practical lessons. And I also noticed that when I stopped fearing mistakes, I started speaking more naturally, because my mind was no longer busy protecting me from embarrassment. It was focused on expressing ideas, and that made my sentences flow more easily, even if they were not grammatically perfect. And over time, I realized that every correction I received, whether from others or from my own reflection, was actually a gift, not a judgment, because it showed me where I could grow, and I began to appreciate those moments instead of avoiding them. And this acceptance also gave me courage to practice more openly, to engage in conversations without waiting until I felt ready, and to understand that readiness is not something you wait for, but something you build through repeated action. And every mistake became a stepping stone rather than a barrier, shaping my confidence quietly in the background. And I also learned that perfection often delays progress, because when you aim to be perfect before starting, you never truly start. But when you accept imperfection, you begin immediately and improve along the way. And this realization helped me break the cycle of hesitation that had once controlled me, and I started valuing progress over perfection, effort over accuracy, and courage over fear. And in that shift, my learning became lighter, more natural, and more enjoyable, because I was no longer carrying the burden of being flawless. I was simply moving forward with whatever I had at the moment, trusting that consistency would refine me over time. And this trust in the process became stronger than my fear of mistakes, allowing me to grow in a way that felt authentic and sustainable rather than forced or pressured. I made consistency my only rule in a way that completely changed how I approached learning and self-growth. Because earlier, I used to believe that big results come from big efforts done occasionally. But slowly I understood that real transformation does not come from intensity alone. It comes from repetition, from showing up even when motivation is missing, from doing small things daily even when they feel insignificant. And this realization shifted my mindset from chasing perfection to building rhythm. So I stopped waiting for perfect days, perfect mood, or perfect circumstances. And I started focusing on what I could do in the present moment, even if it was just a few minutes of speaking, a few sentences of practice, or a short moment of listening with full attention, because I realized that consistency is not about quantity. It is about continuity. It is about refusing to break the chain of effort, no matter how small that effort is. And this approach slowly removed the pressure that used to overwhelm me. Because instead of thinking, I must learn everything today, I started thinking, I must not stop today. And that simple shift made everything more manageable and realistic. And over time, I began to notice that even small daily practices were building something powerful inside me. Something that was not immediately visible, but deeply effective. Like confidence growing quietly beneath the surface. Like understanding becoming more natural without forcing it. And like words starting to flow more easily without overthinking. And there were days when I felt I was not improving at all. But I still continued because I understood that growth is not always visible in the moment. Sometimes it is happening silently in the background, shaping your abilities in ways you cannot immediately measure. And I learned to trust that invisible process, to trust that every small effort was adding up even if I could not see the results instantly. And this trust became my strength, because it kept me moving even when progress felt slow or uncertain. And consistency also taught me discipline without pressure, because I was not forcing myself with guilt or stress. I was simply committing to a small daily promise that I made to myself. And that promise became more important than my mood, more important than my excuses, and more important than my fear of not being good enough. And slowly this habit created a sense of stability in my learning journey, where I was no longer starting and stopping repeatedly, but moving in a steady direction. And that steady movement built momentum, and that momentum built confidence, and that confidence built fluency in a natural way that did not feel forced. And I also realized that consistency has a quiet power that intensity does not, because intensity burns out, but consistency builds foundation, and that foundation supports long-term growth. And with every passing day, I became more comfortable with the process itself, not just the results. And I started enjoying the repetition, the practice, the small improvements, and even the imperfect moments, because they all became part of a bigger journey that I was committed to. And in that commitment, I found a kind of peace, because I was no longer chasing sudden success. I was building something stable within myself, something that would not disappear with time, something that was becoming part of who I was gradually and naturally. And this is how consistency turned from a simple habit into a way of life, shaping not only my skills, but also my mindset, my patience, and my belief in steady progress over instant transformation.